When you slow it down, it looks far more dramatic and perhaps intentional than it certainly was.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to Here's the Scoop from NBC News. I'm Yasmin Basugin. So there is a World Cup controversy over video assistant referees, and Wall Street Journal columnist Jason Gay is saying they're taking the humanity out of the game. Plus, with hundreds of strikes over the past few days, the war in Iran is fully back on. But could the Pentagon be running out of money and weapons? Up first, though. So Democrats in Maine now have to pick a new candidate for Senate because Graham Platner announced last night that he's suspending his campaign. It happened after a woman he dated accused him of sexual assault, which Platner denies.
We're not doing it because of the allegations. We're doing it because of the structures that are being taken away from us by those in power.
So now, Maine Democrats have until July 27th to nominate a new Senate candidate, a candidate that could make or break the Democrats' chances of taking control of the Senate in November. So for more on this, I want to bring in NBC News senior politics reporter Sahil Kapur. Hey, Sahil.
Hey, Yasmin. What a race.
What a race. What a 24 hours. It's been 48 hours, really. So we have now Platner deciding to step aside. And the Maine Democrats were not able to kick him out, by the way. He had to drop out on his own. So then last night, the Maine Democratic Party said they're going to hold this nominating convention to help pick his replacement. Do we have any indication as to what that would look like, the process, how long it would take, and would voters have any say?
So first off, the details are very murky about what comes next. What they've chosen to do, it seems, is a nominating convention where they have a process of selecting delegates and people who would cast these votes and have the candidates try to vie for the support of those delegates. They have not announced when that is, although what I'm hearing from sources early on is that it's going to be probably as close to July 27th to that deadline as they can manage it because they already have so little time and they want to give these candidates the maximum amount of time as possible. You got a lot of them getting in already. And like I said, the details are murky, but there's a ton of interest from Maine Democrats in this nomination.
So let's talk about who potentially could be his replacement. And we know, for instance, that it is not Grey's Anatomy actor Patrick Dempsey, because I guess there were some rumors that possibly he was going to be in the running. And then he came out and he said, I am not. McDreamy is not going to be running. So who, in fact, is going to step in and potentially save the day for Democrats?
Yeah, Patrick Dempsey is not interested in that race, but he seems to be the only one who isn't. There's so many Maine Democrats who are interested. First off, I think we can look to the runners-up in the very crowded primary for governor. Nirav Shah is one of them. He worked for the Maine CDC in prior years. He was a runner-up in the governor primary.
Yeah.
Shenna Bellows, I'm told, the current Maine Secretary of State, is interested in this race, probably going to jump in. She was also a runner-up in the governor primary. There's Troy Jackson, who's worked in the Maine state legislature. He's sort of to some progressives, he's their preferred candidate. He was on Meet the Press Now with our colleague Kristen Welker, and he was asked if he wants Graham Platner's endorsement. He said he didn't, but he's also walking a fine line because he wants to harness that movement, those supporters, more than 150,000 primary votes that Graham Platner got, which is a huge deal. I think that's a record for Maine Democrats. So that's the balance that they have to strike. They need to win over his supporters. They need to harness the movement, the outsider, anti-establishment, populist energy that he very ably tapped into, but fully distance themselves from these horrific allegations, which Platner denies, that ultimately forced him out of the race.
So, you know what I thought, Sahil, is interesting about what Graham Platner said in part of that statement that we just played, is that he said it's not because of the allegations that he's stepping down. He's placing the blame on really the quote-unquote establishment, the Democratic establishment, for taking the power away, the support away from him, versus putting the blame on himself and the allegations that have been made against him. And I'm wondering, by doing that, if in fact he is weakening the chances of the next potential candidate to get the votes, the voters that were most devoted to Platner, right? That are behind his type of movement that he was creating inside of Maine to ultimately beat Susan Collins, who has won over and over and over again. And this seat, as I mentioned, it's integral to Democrats winning power of the Senate.
Yeah, absolutely. So what Graham Platner said was interesting. He denied the allegations again. he essentially said that because of the allegations, he has no ability to run a campaign. He can't raise money anymore. He won't have access to voter data. And he said the movement that he's built, which he remains committed to from an ideological standpoint, that I think his words were that if the movement is to advance, if the movement is to thrive, it cannot be me. So that's him sort of signaling to Maine voters and whoever's involved in the process that comes after this that he wants a candidate who is going to embrace his anti-establishment, lefty populist energy. Of course, it's not really up to him. But does that make it more difficult? I think this entire situation complicates things for Democrats. That's just one of the complications they have to deal with.
So, okay, we're watching Maine, and that's going to progress over the next 2 weeks. But I want to talk quickly about Mitch McConnell, because he's been missing for a little bit. He is obviously a Kentucky senator. He's been hospitalized since June 14th. Multiple Republicans said this week they have spoken to him, but we don't have a clear sense of how he's doing at the moment. Governor Andy Beshear wrote a letter to McConnell asking him to give a public update on his condition. What do we know about what's going on here?
Very little. The only things that we truly know are what his office has disclosed, and that is not much. They have said since June 14th, hours after he was hospitalized, that yes, he's in the hospital. They have said he's receiving excellent care. They have said he's recovering while he's in the hospital. What they have not said is the reason he was hospitalized. We have police scanner audio tracked to his house that paramedics conducted CPR on an unconscious individual at an address we know to belong to Mitch McConnell. They have not even said his office, whether that individual was him. They have not said what his condition is, what the status of his recovery is. They've not said what the timeline is for him to return. He's missed, by my count, the last 21 votes in the Senate.
How big of a problem is it for the Republican agenda with McConnell missing right now?
Yeah, a couple of things. When it comes to floor votes, there are certain categories of things in the Senate that require only a simple majority. That is judges, nominations, maybe if they do another reconciliation bill, but I doubt it. Republicans have 53 senators. Without him, they're down to 52. So they have a margin of error of 2 votes instead of 3 votes. That's the first part of it. The second is the biggest impact that Republicans are already feeling because of the loss of Mitch McConnell from, in-person work is the appropriations process. He's a senior member of the Appropriations Committee. There's a key deadline to fund the government or face a shutdown coming up at the end of September. And they have a 1-vote margin in the Appropriations Committee. Without McConnell, they don't have a majority in the Appropriations Committee, and they can't pass anything without Democrats. So that's where they're feeling it the most, and it's an unfortunate time for that because they're coming up on a crucial moment for appropriations.
Sahil Kapur, thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin.
So as you heard from Sahil, one of the reasons there is concern about Senator McConnell's condition is because he heads the Senate Appropriations Panel. And that panel actually controls the Pentagon's budget. Multiple sources have told NBC News that the Pentagon is now running out of money. So they're asking for more, $67 billion to be exact. Meanwhile, the war in Iran is back on. So is Congress going to give the Department of Defense money? And if not, how long is this going to go on? I want to bring in NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube for this. Hey, Court.
Hi.
So the president has vowed as of this moment that the U.S. is going to keep striking Iran. What is, from your understanding, from your reporting, from your digging, the strategy here? And how has Iran reciprocated these strikes?
So this is all about the Strait of Hormuz at this point. So if Iran were to stop attacking commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz, I don't think the U.S. military would continue carrying out strikes inside Iran, because we've had stretches here where there's been no back and forth fire. And it's always been when Iran has fired missiles or drones or whatever it is, specifically at commercial ships that are in that southern part of the Strait of Hormuz, that's when the U.S. military responds. And it is a clear, on both sides, a clear violation of the Memorandum of Understanding, which I don't know where that even stands at this point. So, but as long as there's going to be a threat to the Strait of Hormuz, the U.S. military will continue to target. I think the big question right now is we have seen this latest iteration escalate exponentially faster and wider than the previous times where the IRGC and the U.S. military have gone back and forth. So is this one the game changer that actually does lead the U.S. and Iran back into a state of major combat operations? We just don't know yet at this point. We do know that every single day CENTCOM is providing more options for President Trump for even bigger strikes, moving further inland. As we saw last night, they started going after infrastructure again. And the U.S. military's naval blockade is absolutely one of the options on the table that they are actively discussing right now.
So I think we can both agree that they're at an elevated state of conflict, the most elevated they've been since there was, this quote unquote ceasefire that was called. But then I think the question is, okay, what's the stockpile? What's the Pentagon operating on? And that refers me to your reporting that the Pentagon is actually running out of money. And we're going to dig into kind of the money of it all in a moment. But are they running out of weapons right now? Is the U.S. running low?
So the stockpiles are lower than they have been in years, yes. If President Trump were to say right this second, I want you to restart combat operations, the military does have enough in their stockpile that they could restart. And they could carry out weeks of bombing in Iran. They don't have as much as they would like, but they have enough to actually carry out a conflict. The biggest concern is the defensive piece, and that has been a concern for several years now. Back to last June when the U.S. was involved in Midnight Hammer and then the 12-day war, the U.S. military expended a huge number of their PAC-3s, so those are the missiles that are used in the Patriot systems for like long-range shooting down or intercepting of ballistic missiles. They expended a huge number of those sorts of things, and they take years to rebuild. And the number that the companies that build them right now, the number that they can build per year is way smaller than the deficit that the U.S. has. Now, they're trying to build that up. Companies like Lockheed Martin are building these new facilities. They're trying to ramp up their production. But they are at such a deficit right now that it is concerning for military officials.
So I want to get into the ask from the Pentagon, but let's first talk about operating costs now, because a few months ago, back in April, Trump administration officials said they had spent $25 billion in the war with Iran so far, which felt low at the time. Do we know how much more they have spent since then? Because the Pentagon budget right now is operating at $891 billion, close to $1 trillion.
And they have an even bigger request now. So it's confusing. There's these sort of three big buckets, and they are enormous buckets. One is this roughly $1 trillion Pentagon budget request. Then there is this supplemental that was about $88 billion, and about $67 billion of that is specifically supposed to go to rebuilding or resupplying what happened during the war in Iran. Some of that actually is to go to the State Department for fixing damage to bases and or embassies around the world. But we know there has been extensive damage to U.S. military facilities all over that region. We know that their stockpile has been greatly depleted. Some of their munitions, their most advanced capable munitions, are down by 50 or 60% from where they were before the war started. So that $67 billion, the best we can understand, because this process has been extremely opaque, is that is literally to rebuild what was broken down during the 40 days or so of the war. What's not clear if that includes the continuing costs that we're seeing right now, which is 24 ships that are hanging out south of the Strait of Hormuz right now that could be called back into the blockade. Every day that they're operating out there is costing money. So the $25 billion or so that was several weeks ago, you got to assume that it's got to be 3 or 4 times that at this point.
Okay, so now they're asking for the $67 billion more. Is there any possibility they're going to get this, especially with what I started with, i.e., Senator Mitch McConnell, who has been out, I think Sahil said he's been out for 21 votes by his count at this point. He's head of Senate Appropriations Committee. Can they do it?
So I think the McConnell factor is definitely going to put a wrench in this and make it difficult. But even bigger is we are hearing increasingly from both sides of the aisle that the Pentagon and the administration have not been honest with them and transparent about what has been happening in this war. They've not been transparent about the munition stockpiles, about the overall strategic goals. And that as long as they don't have that transparency, I don't see members of Congress being willing to write that giant check. And remember, there has been this back and forth. It's almost right along partisan lines, but there has been a back and forth over whether the Congress could even tell President Trump, you're not allowed to continue with the war. You're not allowed to restart major combat operations. But that is the biggest impediment to this right now. You talk to these members one-on-one and they say, look, of course we want the military to have everything they need, but we need the administration. We're supposed to be the oversight of this, and we don't have the information that we need to conduct adequate oversight of tens of billion dollars of taxpayer money. And that's not even including the additional money that the Hill is talking about right now, this $350 billion in reconciliation. A significant chunk of that would also likely go to the Pentagon. So how this is manifesting right now is all of this money, these billions of dollars that have been spent on the war in Iran, the overall operating costs, they have to take it from other accounts. So things like training is suffering. Things like travel, the things that are not seen as critical to continuing operations right now, they're robbing Peter to pay Paul. And it's starting to have a direct impact on the men and women in the military in the U.S. right now.
Courtney Kube, as always, thank you.
Thanks, Yaz.
So the World Cup is in the midst of the quarterfinals right now. But if you are an Egypt fan, it's still really tough to get over that 3-2 loss to Argentina in the round of 16. That includes New York City Mayor Zohar Mamdani, who even found a way to work it into a press conference about faster buses.
With my extra 6 minutes, I would probably just watch the replays of Egypt getting robbed again and again yesterday. Just gotta throw up the VAR.
So VAR, it stands for Video Assistant Referee. It's this technology that the refs used to overturn one of Egypt's goals on Tuesday. And Mamdani, by the way, is not the only person that is pissed about this. The Egyptian Football Association has filed an official complaint with FIFA about what it's calling an improper use of VAR. And also, some like Wall Street Journal columnist Jason Gay are now calling for an end to VAR entirely. And he's joining me now to make the case. Hi, Jason.
Hi, how are you?
So for folks that don't know, that haven't been glued to their TVs watching the World Cup and don't know what VAR is and how it works, tell us.
It's effectively a screen that is observing all the action on the field for potential review. I mean, you have individuals who are watching the technology. There's actually technology to determine things like offsides. There's technology in the ball, which allows us to figure out if there was contact made with a player. It's basically, the eye in the sky. And what it has done here is made chaos of many brilliant moments in the sport and taken, I think, a lot of the joy out of why people enjoy loving this game.
There were two instances that you outlined in your piece in which VAR was used that a bad call was made. First was U.S. and Bosnia-Herzegovina, and then most recently it was Egypt and Argentina.
Right. Well, let's take them piece by piece. In the United States situation, we're talking about the call that was made to give Fowler Balogun a red card, the big disputed red card that ended up getting suspended and allowing him to play. That was a case where he made contact with a player, and when you put it into sort of granular context, when you slow it down, it looks far more dramatic and perhaps intentional than it certainly was. And the kinds of things that happen in real time, often right in front of the referee, they don't get called. And when you put them through, again, that sort of granular slow motion review, it leaves the potential for reversals that kind of go against the spirit of the way the game is supposed to be interpreted. And that's really what people are arguing about with regard to contact and red reviews and things like that. In the Egypt-Argentina case, that was a case where you had this epic second half, game-defining, possibly, legendary goal being scored by Egypt where they go the entire length of the pitch, pass the ball between four players, make this brilliant goal to go up 2-0, and then the whole thing gets just spun back, almost like time travel, to
like
go
2
back.
minutes later. Like 2 minutes later.
Not a full 2 minutes, but 20
fine.
seconds, which felt like 2 minutes. I mean,
did.
absolutely. It was a play that felt several plays prior. In which a player for Egypt made contact with an Argentinian player, and obviously I'm being a little bit hyperbolic here, but it felt like getting pulled over in Rhode Island for a speeding ticket in Oregon. It really felt like a perversion of what VAR and instant replay is supposed to be about. And by the way, soccer's not alone here. I mean, every sport is now wrestling with this, these interruptions that we're constantly getting from these reviews.
To play devil's advocate here, right? Isn't VAR technology actually supposed to make the games and the calls more fair?
That is the idea, no question about it. The idea is accuracy, right, at the end of the day. But I think that one thing we should explore here is, what is this supposed to be all about anyway with sports? Are we striving for absolute perfection in a sport which is played by imperfect humans and has been traditionally officiated by imperfect humans? And isn't part of what sports is learning the process through which life is sometimes unfair and yet goes on? Many of us have watched many sporting events from the ages we were playing them and realized that in the end, it kind of all does work out. And what
does it though?
VAR,
if you lose, it doesn't.
For sure, no question about it. And there are many people who remember, the 1985 World Series or blown calls or anything like that, and will say, "Thank goodness for instant replay." However, I think the net effect here has been to strip a lot of the human joy out of these games.
It seems, though, also like humans in general are more susceptible to, for instance, taking sides. And I only say that because if we're looking at today's game, right, France and Morocco, all of the refs are Argentinian. So you would think that those refs would go into this saying, it would probably be better if Argentina was up against Morocco versus up against France and have it be like a whole remake of the last World Cup.
Well, it wouldn't be 2026 without abundant conspiracy theorizing in almost every aspect of human life, right? So I'm not surprised that it has come.
FIFA.
Yeah, especially when it comes to something like FIFA. But I'm telling you, we have really gone over the edge here. I go to youth soccer games now where you see parents holding up their phones, waving them around to the referee, saying like, I got it on tape here. Come look at this. You can now buy technology in which you can actually do the lines for your own tennis tournaments, for your own, playing in the backyard. It's absurd to the which people have taken this.
Wall Street Journal columnist Jason Gay, thank you.
Thank you.
That's going to do it for us at Here's the Scoop from NBC News. I'm Yasmin Vasugan. We'll be back tomorrow with whatever the day may bring. And if you like what you heard and you saw, press the subscribe button. We'll see you tomorrow.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.